Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Each week I have, well, this week's pretty special. Each week I have the opportunity to bring before you men and women who, because of the movement of the Holy Spirit in their hearts and minds, were brought home to the church. But tonight our guest is a woman who's been a lifelong Catholic, but also a longtime friend. And it's good to have Joanna Bogle back on the Journey Home program. She's an English author, journalist, broadcaster, and familiar to most of you EWTN viewers for her program Feasts and Seasons. She's certainly been on the Journey Home before, and she has a blog. She's a blog writer, the modern equivalent of the Hilar Bellocks who had to write a book every week to stay alive. Well, now we got the modern blog writers that have got something to say every day. JoannaBogle.blogspot.com if you want to write that down. But Joanna, it is so good to have you back on the Journey Home.
Great to be here.
It's good to have you just around to sit and talk. And what's amazing I'll say to the audience that Joanna and I talk quite a bit, but we are never refighting the American Revolution. That battle doesn't get in. What we're really talking about is the growth of the faith in the church on both sides of the big pond, right? I mean,
very much so. Yes, yes.
And things, even in the time we've known each other, was almost 20 years. The world has changed a lot in that time in the way the church is affecting both countries.
Very much so. We've seen extraordinary things. Some good, some very good, some bad, and I would say lots of very good things in the church and some really rather ghastly things in society. Yes, extraordinary changes in all sorts of ways.
I mean, one thing that we see from over here is, we look on what's happening with the royal family and all of politics there. There seems to be an openness to the Catholic Church amongst the hires in England. We don't understand it, at least I don't understand it that well as American, but it seems that there's a softening, an openness, a willingness, just what we're seeing in our news.
I would say, taken with a wide sweep of history, that is certainly true. I think if you had said to anyone 100 years ago, and certainly 200 years ago, that the heir to our throne would go to a papal funeral, cancelling his own wedding arrangements to do so, which is exactly what happened with Prince Charles and the funeral of Blessed John Paul, the great John Paul, they would have been astounded. They would have been astounded. And we have, in my lifetime, seen two really magnificent papal visits to Britain. And in 2012, we'll have the anniversary of the visit of John Paul to Britain. And then just 2 years ago, we had this state visit of our present Holy Father, which was a triumph, a magnificent success. Gosh, that would have seemed absolutely unthinkable to anyone in Victorian England, and beyond unthinkable to anyone in Georgian England. I mean, just completely impossible. So yeah, there is an openness, and we've seen some very significant conversions to the church. There's a slight danger in this, in that at one level it's now quite chic to be Catholic in Britain. It's quite chic in the sense that, Catholics were persecuted hundreds of years ago, so it's sort of chic to be a persecuted minority, so it's very okay to be Catholic in that way. At another level, of course, it's not all right to be Catholic, because the Church's position on protection of the unborn, abortion is a disgraceful and ghastly thing to do. The idea that the Church says two men cannot marry, not may not, but cannot, is regarded as a dreadful thing to say. And we are probably going to have gay marriage, unquote, dumped on us by Parliament. Please God, we may be able to oppose it, but it doesn't look as if the opposition will win, because, the government has a majority and so on. So at another level, things could be difficult, not only for Catholics, but for all people of deep religious convictions. And already there's a very good alliance between Catholics and evangelicals and Jewish people who are very, very concerned about the new marriage, soi-disant marriage, how can you call it marriage? The new marriage proposals. So at one level, for good Catholics who love the Church, loyal to the Holy Father, I think things could be tough. But at another level, there's this new openness to the Church and a rediscovery of our history. The most recent royal wedding last year, Prince William's wedding, was in one way a very Catholic ceremony. Westminster Abbey, lots of ornate robes, candles, things that they would not have had at a royal wedding in the 18th century. So yeah.
So you're a lifelong Catholic?
Yes, I am.
Never even for a second put your toe outside the church and visited or considered or...
Considered, yes. I'm certainly a lifelong Catholic, baptised as a baby. I'm very grateful for the faith I was taught. Certainly in my, not teens, early 20s, I found Protestant churches very attractive in a way, because it all looked very jolly and very open. And in a way, of course, whatever you're brought up with is slightly boring, isn't it? You know, it just is. And I'd always gone to Mass every Sunday, and thank God I've never stopped. There was never a time I broke that. But there was a slight sense in which particularly Anglican churches were very beautiful, lovely music. I love singing hymns, still do. I liked a lovely open service, but to be honest, I think what helped me was that when the Catholic Church introduced the vernacular, English in the liturgy, some of it's been dreadful. We all know about that. Silly guitars and stupid songs and poor English. Yep. But even allowing for that...
You mean American English?
Well, a little bit, yes. Mid-Atlantic, we would say. Some really ghastly jargon. Now we have the Mass in beautiful English, no problem. But for a while, when I was in my 20s, I remember thinking, I love the Mass in English. But I also loved the Anglican service with its dignity and so on. It seemed to me they have the best of both worlds. I was brought up on a very silent Mass and so on. And I love the Latin tradition, but I wanted a Mass I could see and hear. And I do find it much easier to pray the Mass, to pray it when it's a mix of Latin and English. And you know what's going on, you hear it, you know it's valid. If it's all silent, how do you know it's valid and so on? So to one degree, I never wanted to be anything other than a Catholic. One church, one faith, one Lord. There's just no doubt in my mind about
When
that.
I was a strong evangelical Protestant, regardless of whether I was a first ordained a Congregationalist and then very quickly Presbyterian, but really during all that time, my loyalty as how I understood my faith was English, but it was the English evangelicals, the C.S. Lewis's. It was that strand of evangelicalism that was a part of the church, or maybe even separate from the church, but very committed to inspiration of Scripture, conversion to Jesus Christ, evangelization, living a holy life. I mean, but it really came from the English to America. Had great influence on here. Did that have an influence on you?
Yes, it did. I remember as a Catholic in my late teens being urged to read C.S. Lewis, and it was an enormous help. It nurtured my faith. I have to say it made me more of a Catholic, because C.S. Lewis was profoundly Catholic in his thinking. For example, on purgatory, I mean, his letters to Malcolm, and he writes about purgatory very beautifully. But I did find this urgency that he had in explaining the faith, and he did that in wireless radio talks at the time during the Second World War, and he had a huge and wonderful influence on people. But it was, in that sense, evangelistic. I'm also very fortunate in that, as a Catholic, and I certainly never wavered. I mean, we went to Mass every Sunday, and I thank my mother for that. It was non-negotiable. I mean, of course you go to Mass on Sunday. I mean, people died for this. This is, you don't even think about not going. Of course, you must pray and be devout when you're there, but it's absolutely minimal that you go at the holy sacrifice of the Mass. This is heaven on earth. Don't even think. And I'm so grateful for my mother that the discipline of our family was that Sunday is sacred and you go to Mass on Sunday. I'm so grateful for that. I think there's a lot to be said for family discipline in that way. But I did find C.S. Lewis and that evangelistic thing meshed beautifully with my Catholic faith. And I was reading him alongside Ronald Knox, and as I got older, a bit older by then, reading John Henry Newman, a bit chewy for my teenage years, but I remember reading his Apologia Pro Vita Sua on the train and finding it so exciting, really that I missed the station at Clapham Junction and went whooshing on to Waterloo. And I know that was when I was in my 20s, because I was working on a newspaper then in Richmond, and that was the line. And when I got to Waterloo, oh gosh, I'd been reading. So all of that really helped. I think that English tradition too, and the English language under the providence of God has become the world language. And I was conscious of that. And so much in the best of the English tradition was also shaped by a certain Anglicanism, which it's just a reality of history. For a lot of people, that's how they came to know Almighty God. So there's something in it there. Almighty God used that. And of course, I was also a patriot. I hope I still am, although there's so much about my country that is ghastly at the moment. But I love my country, and you can't love it without loving the whole of that tradition. And there's something very beautiful about that. Then, of course, the English Catholic tradition, which is very rich, and that was the heritage into which I was born, and I love it.
Many viewers, we've received emails from viewers that when they hear conversion stories, sometimes I wouldn't want to use the word jealous or envious, but sometimes they'll express the idea that, I've been faithful in my faith all my life, but I wish I had that. I wish I had had that empowering awakening. Maybe if I had had something like that, it might make me appreciate what I've had all along. And I'm wondering, as you look back in your own life, talk about so you would represent those that have been the long run, not the short sprints, but the long distance runner in the faith. But have you had awakening with doctrine within that?
Yes, I've never been jealous of somebody who had a conversion story, but like a lot of lifelong Catholics, I've been fascinated by it. We all adore reading their conversion stories. I think I would also say, and gosh, I'm not unusual in this at all, I owe a lot to previous converts because my grandfather converted to the Catholic faith. And this was a massive thing for him. I mean, it was long before I was born. It was in the 1930s, and my mother was 11 or 12 at the time. And so she converted too. So this was a massively important part of our family history. And in a sense, the way I was brought up was to be told a great deal about that. And the books I've mentioned, particularly Ronald Knox and Chesterton, of course, again, and Newman, particularly John Henry Newman.
And Woodhouse had a big part to play in all that too, right?
Who could not be enchanted by P.G. Woodhouse? Oh, and so much more. And I have to say, the whole English thing about being funny, that's also, I don't know whether it's Merry England, but that was part of our... Yeah, I think that whole English Catholic thing, what a pity P.G. Woodhouse wasn't. Imagine Bertie Wooster going off to toddling off to mass. It ought to have happened. I can't see him being as anything very... But
sorry to distract you.
No, that's all right. But that whole sort of English Catholic conversion thing was hugely important in my family background. And when I was a little girl, we didn't go to mass in a church because there wasn't one near where we lived. And we used to walk past the local Anglican church, which was a magnificent, beautiful pre-Reformation building, to the tea hut in the park where there was mass. And I didn't realise the word tea hut meant the hut where you have tea. It was only much later it dawned on me, of course, I'd also been there during the week and had ice cream. So it was the tea hut. But the word tea hut, I ran the word together. To me, it was just the place where you had mass. But I remember my mother explaining that, of course, there was only one church and there was a dreadful muddle in Henry VIII. And so there was the Anglican Church, which was temporary, and it was all a great pity. And the Queen was a wonderful person. We were all 100% loyal to her. Very patriotic family. My father in the army and all of that. Very patriotic. Stand up when the royal family, when the national anthem was played and all that. But it was just a muddle, and we were part of that original church. And I always understood that, and also that Grandpa had made not a massive sacrifice, but some social sacrifice to become a Catholic. It wasn't always quite so easy in the 30s. And it was also perceived, in the way I understood it as a child, as a very significant intellectual thing, that it was an intellectually coherent thing and there was always more to learn. And my memory of my grandpa, who was a dear, was very much books, big picture of Thomas More, big shabby old flat, a certain sort of sorrow in their life. That First World War generation, and he got a dreadful cough every winter because of the gassing in the trenches and all of that. Very patriotic, very patriotic. So that was very much part of their Catholicism. It was intellectually coherent, real. Grandpa went to mass every morning. I remember staying with my grandparents as a little treat in their very shabby, cosy house, cold, bookish, going with Grandpa to morning mass. These were very profound things. I think in the end, though, even if you're brought up a Catholic, you do have to have your own conversion experience.
Right.
And at some point in my 20s, I came to understand in a very strong way exactly why I was a Catholic. I owe a lot to a thing called the faith movement. I owe a lot to the faith movement, which was an intellectually coherent, passionately loyal to the church movement, synthesizing faith and science. That's never been my thing. I'm no scientist. But it gave this intellectual crunch at a time when there was a lot of confusion in the church in the 70s. I wouldn't say it was a conversion experience, but it made me understand, yes, you can defend your faith, and also you keep learning about it, keep reading, not just Newman, but all the newer people too.
Well, with that, what you're saying is, and I agree, every single individual person needs to make an intellectual, willful choice of Jesus Christ and the church.
Yes. And this is not even just a once-off choice, because you have to keep making it, and there will be times, and I'm sure there will be times in my life yet to come, and in all our lives, where you have to make that choice again, perhaps under difficult circumstances, when life isn't always easy. One's private life, it may not be easy. Just because it's been relatively smooth, it might not always be the case. You have to make a choice. And this is a choice of the heart and the mind and the soul. And the mind is part of that. I was very much taught that. I would also say that the English Catholicism in which I was brought up was in one sense very tolerant. It had to be, because we had learned, if you like, the hard way, that you have to be tolerant in the real sense of the word. That doesn't mean everything is acceptable, but you live with what is unacceptable in the hopes of, changing it. Patriotic, very English, but not stupidly, but a great love of country based on also the sacrifice of war and so on. And I was brought up on stories of that, of course, Dunkirk and all of that. And also a largeness of view. The Catholic Church is true, and you believe it because it is true. And this is a truth consecrated by the blood of martyrs in our land, in our city, in London, Thomas More, Edmund Campion. But there was also a sense in which my father, who was not a Catholic, when my parents married, it was what was called a mixed marriage, but my father was the most wonderful person, just a terrific person, and very much the moral leader of our family, a wonderful daddy and a terrific, just the best husband and father there could be. And I knew, and everybody knew, and he knew, that the reason he was not a Catholic was not because he chose not to be, but he was born into an England where for 400 years the Catholic Church was persecuted. I don't think until he met my mother. In fact, he told me once, until I met your mother, he never met a Catholic. And the families knew each other and they liked each other. And when Mummy and Daddy got married, everyone was delighted, But for him, Catholicism was jolly good, but it wasn't something that was in his heritage. And that gave us an understanding that you needed a large view of things. But having said that, I also learned from my father, funnily enough, a deep respect for the Catholic Church, because I remember in discussions on the great moral issues of the 60s, my father was 100% with the Pope. I think your Pope is right. Which was grand. It gave me an understanding, here is Peter on the rock. I think your Pope is right. And I've always remembered that in a funny way. He taught me some Catholic morality in a very profound way. And I remember... Which
may have helped you then appreciate it more than you otherwise would have.
Yes, very much. And I also remember my father being profoundly moved when he would come to Mass with us, profoundly moved. And at my wedding, I'm going to start crying in a minute, which was a lovely, happy, happy day. I remember my father weeping. Well, I suppose daddies do, because... And I was terribly close to my father, the most lovely daddy on earth and everything. And there'd been all this excitement and fuss and Mummy and me enjoying every moment of all of this and so on. And then Mummy was sitting in the front pew and here's Daddy leading me in. And of course he wept, and of course I wept. But it was partly because the Mass was very beautiful. The words are so glorious. And here was this fine young man, Jamie Bogle, and he's a Catholic, a convert. So my parents were thrilled. Everything was fine. But I do think that my father's great reverence for the Mass was partly precisely, he saw it with a very sort of freshness that perhaps only a non-Catholic could see. And I mean, that is something magnificent, the holding up of this, this transformed bread, which is unimaginable. This is Jesus Christ. I mean, this is awesome. Maybe one takes it for granted as a Catholic.
Well,
and we shouldn't. We shouldn't.
It can be, just as in any faith, you can start taking for granted what you've always seen. And that doesn't say that what they're doing is bad just because you take it for granted, but you've got to take a step back and look at it and say, is this true? And that's the issue. I mean, it's truth that stands. As I've often said, something is true not because the Catholic Church said it's true, but the Catholic Church said it's true because it's true.
Yes.
I mean, there's a real fine distinction, and that's what we try and point to.
Yes.
I did have another question, which, when you say England, as I'm listening as an American, are you thinking of England, or are you thinking of Britain, which includes Ireland and Scotland, the church in England? Are you thinking of that, or do you think of a unified church of Ireland and Scotland and
Well, a
England?
very interesting point. I suppose if I'm honest, I am English, and I think about England as England, and this is a very tense point at the moment because of Scotland perhaps having a declaration of independence, there's this possible referendum and so on. I am passionately committed to the Union. I think the Union has served Scotland very well, and Wales and so on. The whole Irish thing is a great big agony. But I must admit to a certain English arrogance, which is not particularly attractive in me. If I think of Scotland, I think of it as a magnificent nation. It is another nation. It's at one level quite different, and I wouldn't dream of thinking of myself claiming Scotland in that sense. But I have to say, I think the union of England and Scotland has served both of them very, very well. And certainly in terms of England, Scotland has been magnificent. It's provided us with many of the leaders of Britain and the innovators and the engineers and the intellectuals and the fabulous heritage. So if there ever is a break, I, along with most people in Britain, England and Scotland, I think I would regard it as a tragedy. Of course, the English have been unbearably arrogant, but we all know that. I mean, that's something you're also brought up with. And we've now become adept at apologising, which is probably quite good. I am conscious as well that as a Londoner, I'm arrogant about being a Southerner, a Londoner. I am probably somewhere in my background there's a sort of sneering at other people, which is revolting. But having said that, I'm not sure I'm being quite genuine, because I'm very conscious of all the faults of the English. And I'm also conscious that I'm living now in a dying culture. I mean, our birth rate across Europe, we're dying, we're dying. The future of Britain, and particularly England, is in doubt, because the biggest single growth is in the Islamic population, in the Islamic faith. Many of our cities are now likely to be Islamic in the short term. And there's no point in being arrogantly English. It's an anachronism to be. We have to be humble and admit that we have lost so much. And even this Catholic resurgence, which we see, very gently, but we see it, is a gift of God in tough times. And in these tough times, there won't be much room for English arrogance. Yeah. I'm allowed to cherish what I love about England, but I'm under no illusions. And I'm under no illusions.
In America, it seems that what I would call the most prominent heresy in America is the individualism of the faith, which is a Jesus in me, without any need for a church or anyone else to tell me what that means, Jesus in me. So on the positive side, well, they love Jesus Christ, a surrender to Jesus Christ, a love for Scripture, maybe trying to live it out. But any idea that I need to be a part of a church or sacraments or even somebody or some group telling me how to live my faith, that's at best an add-on, man-made, but it's just Jesus in me. I see that across America. Does that hit England?
Yes and no. I think a bigger problem in England is a sort of casual secular view, which has a lovely spiritual mushiness when I need it. This is a legacy of Anglicanism. It's the legacy of an established church. I think you could get it even if the established church was Catholic, and I'm very glad it isn't. I don't really like that concept of an established church. It's not, in the end, been that helpful. Truth is truth. It will triumph, you know. You don't need to have it imposed by the government. But, or even too arrogant a church is not a good thing. No, a bigger problem in Britain is, oh, well, I think I'm a Christian. I don't go to church, of course, but the church is sort of there for nice things, for making me feel good when somebody dies. They'll whoosh into heaven and we'll have a lovely church service, and it's church, you know. It's almost the church without Christ, rather than it's the opposite of the American problem, which is Christ without the church. It's a mushy, you get this silly expression where people say, well, Joanna, I'm not a Catholic, but I'm a very spiritual person. And I've always wanted to say the other way around. Well, I'm a Catholic because it's all true, and I know I should live this way, and I love it, but I'm not really a very spiritual person, you know, I have to tell myself. So that's perhaps not entirely true, but I say it deliberately do you know what I mean? We're all spiritual people, so of course we are, but I find it's a mushy, slightly bogus, unconsciously arrogant feeling of, I don't really need Jesus Christ with the nails rammed through his hands. I'm a very nice person, really. And oh, Jesus is lovely, but, you know, I'm very spiritual and I love the mountains, or something rubbish like that. I would say that's our biggest heresy. That and consumerism, you know, shopping, food. Our biggest problem is obesity, smugness, a lax sexual morality, because, after all, who cares, so long as you're nice to people. And a slightly soppy, I give money to charity and I'm a nice person and all that. And then an indulgence. I don't see why you're so fussy about the faith, Joanna. You know, they're all religions are alike, all this kind of drivel. And in fact, I think I see a certain strength in that American commitment to Jesus, but you're right, without the church, it degenerates into nothing, just into nothing. And the thing I learned, and it's very important in our history, is Peter as the rock. Jesus Christ founded a visible church. And where Henry VIII in 1535, you know, breaking with the church, made the mistake was he thought he could be head of the church. And in fairness, there was a muddle there, because there always had been a sense in which the king was head of the church, but it had always been under Peter. And Henry VIII did a UDI. He wanted the church on his own terms. But he died, in that sense, a Catholic. He had the sacraments. He believed in the Mass every day. He left money for Masses to be said for his soul. He believed in saints and Our Lady. But he didn't want the humility. There is Peter. And the thing I've realized is a great, great strength in the theological muddles of our day is Peter. Now, we've been blessed with some truly holy popes. John the 23rd, a man of holiness, and Pope Paul VI, who Pope in difficult times, very holy, and he suffered, the agony of Humanae Vitae and everyone attacking him. But he said what was true and beautiful, and there was ghastly suffering. You could see it etched on his face in the latter photograph. Blessed Pope John Paul, a great man, the full measure of whose greatness we're just beginning to see. I think he's right up there with Leo the Great and Gregory the Great. Barbarians at the gate, and here is John Paul, great. And the present Holy Father, unquestionably the greatest mind on the planet at the moment. So we've been blessed with great popes, but even the ones that were not great were Peter. They were the rock. And to me, that's the great thing. And martyrs died for this in England. I mean, blood-soaked soil of London. Golly, the Tower of London, the rack, the chopping block.
Well, you and I stood on that little spot out in the middle of the traffic jam.
Where they hanged people
the
at Tyburn.
Right there, the little plaque in the middle of the road.
Yes, it's a traffic island now where the Edgware Road meets the edge of Oxford Street. And that's where they were hanged and drawn and quartered. I was there the other day, actually, because I had to cross, and I stopped and kissed the ground and said the Hail Mary. You just don't get fussed when you're middle-aged, so who cares, And I remember thinking, oh, Edmund Campion, pray for me, because I'm such a stupid, arrogant woman, and golly, I think I'm important. And you're just not. History won't remember me. But what a privilege. There we are. And then there's, when I was a little girl, I was 11 and transferring to senior school, and we had a choice of outings for the end of term. And I signed up to go to Hampton Court Palace, but then all my friends said they wanted to go to the Tower of London, so I signed up for the Tower of London instead, and I wished I hadn't, because it haunted my nights for a long time afterwards. I'd wake up in the night worrying about the rack and the dungeon, and I remember my mother getting a bit cross that they'd taken us to the Tower. We were a little too young. And she told me, I don't think, when you had your head chopped off in those days, I don't think you felt anything after the first moment or two. There you were in heaven. So I was to lie down and snuggle down and go to sleep, and really being beheaded wasn't so bad, and I was not to worry because it didn't really hurt. I don't think that was true, but I think it's what you say to a little girl of 11 in the middle of the night. And as an adult, I'm sort of grateful for that early experience. And again, I'm not sure I would take children to the dungeons of the Tower. But when I last went back, I remember thinking, you're a grown woman, Joanna, and you need to understand that people really suffered for the faith. So think about that. You're not 11 years old now. And you and your mother both know that this was a gift of faith passed on at the cost of sacrifice. So live it like that and don't show off about it. You've got the easy version in the 21st century, chum.
Well, we have to say the same here in the States. We have to appreciate the faith that we have because our forefathers, mothers, fought very hard for the freedoms we have here. We just can't take these freedoms for granted or abused, and too far as if, even the Holy Father during the time of the French Revolution was warning against the abuse of freedom. So, but let's take a break now and we'll come back, because a few more things we can talk about when we come back at the second half of the program. All right, see you later. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi. My guest tonight is Joanna Bogle. And the biggest problem that I have is I've got about a half hour, and there's far too much that I'd like to talk to you about, Joanna. One thing that we've seen on The Journey Home over the years, as people have talked about, is that when God opens someone's heart and minds to the beauty and the fullness of the church, that conversion is not just for that person. It can have an impact like a stone thrown into the lake with the ripple effect.
Yes, I think that's true.
It can affect other people. And in that sense, I do believe that a convert needs to be very humbly grateful for what, by God's mercy, we've come to discover. A lifelonger needs to be humbly grateful for what you've had all your life, because your life, my life, the guests on the journey home, have an effect on spouse, children, grandchildren,
Yes.
friends, and neighbors as a witness. That's the new evangelization that our Holy Father talks about. And so sometimes we're given that gift so that it can affect others. Do you see that even as the strength of your faith now as a result of that?
Oh, gosh, yes, I do. My grandfather became a Catholic, my mother's father. I think largely it was started by the Great War, the First World War. His generation was so idealistic and they loved England, that lovely Edwardian England that seems so enchanting in retrospect, before cars and television and noise and so on. You know, ladies in long frocks and big hats and all that. And there was this immense nobility. If you look at that heartbreaking poetry of the Great War, you know, Rupert Brooke, if I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field which is forever England. I mean, absolutely. But then it all ended with the mud and the blood and the Battle of the Somme, the most tragic day in the history of the British Army, first day of the Battle of the Somme, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of boys, all Christian, machine gunning one another. The French and the English against the Austrians and the Germans, all Christians, mostly, lots of them Catholics, massacring one another, ghastly. So after the First World War, the Anglican Church didn't emerge terribly well from it, in the sense that it looked rather silly as an established church, you know. And in England, the Catholic Church did emerge rather well, because you'd had these padres, the Catholic chaplains. There was freedom for the Catholic faith by that time in English history. And they were right there in the front line, anointing the sick, whereas the Anglicans didn't have a sacramental theology. What do you do with the dying? Whereas a Catholic priest knows what you do. You hear his confession, you anoint him. And prayer for the dead. These men have gone to God. We can ask for God's mercy on their souls. There's purgatory. Whereas what do you do if you're an Anglican, you know? What is the communion of saints? They didn't know. They didn't think you could pray for the dead. It's a mess. It's a mess. The dead are dead. They can. Whereas for Catholics, the dead are part of us. We pray for them. The holy souls. I think
You're
all
almost
that.
reminding me of something, though. I don't want to take you off track, but it's almost like you need to know just what you said to understand Brideheads Revisited.
Well, that's certainly true. And that
You need to know that background to appreciate a book like that.
That's true. And that backwash of the Great War, which also destroyed the optimism of Edwardian England, all that, everything is going to get a little bit better and so on. And Grandpa and Granny, they'd eloped actually when they got married, because Granny was working in the household where my grandfather was the sort of son of the house, and so a very big sort of controversy, because she was only the lady's companion to his aunt and was deemed not suitable and all that. So when they got married, they were quite enthusiastic socialists, and Granny was a suffragette and so on. And I think there was a great optimism in Edwardian England, and they were Fabian Society members and so on. Then comes the Great War, and of course Grandpa immediately, you know, commissioned and goes and fights. And then there was this disillusionment afterwards, but the Catholic Church had emerged rather well from the Great War, because a certain confident Anglicanism had not emerged well. So when Grandpa became a Catholic, first he became an Anglican and then got higher and higher, you know, and so on. And my mother told me all about this. She was 11, 12, 13, something like that, when he converted, and she became, of course, a Catholic too, along with a couple of her brothers, not the oldest, who was already grown up. Yes, that had an effect on me. And I can remember this being discussed very much when I was a teenager, the books my mother encouraged me to read. There's a lot of talking about why you are a Catholic. It's very important. And when my parents got married, Mummy had been, as it were, brought up a Catholic from the age of 12. It was very important to her. The two families, they knew each other. My mother's parents and my father's parents knew each other in the Second World War, when their respective children were all away at the war. Mummy was evacuated, and Daddy, of course, was a soldier. And then when they met, my father's family were not Catholic, and my father was not a Catholic, and they had a wonderful 40-year wonderful marriage. But I would say Grandpa's conversion had made my mother the Catholic she was. It was understood that any children of their marriage would be brought up Catholic. We all were. My father was comfortable with that. He thought the Catholic Church was jolly good, even though he never became a Catholic. But he was a terrific man. So, yes, Grandpa's conversion produced all of that. And now here I am, you know, talking to you.
Yeah.
I do think that conversion, which always brings with it some sacrifice. I think there were difficulties in my grandfather's life that he didn't really explain, but it was all very socially complicated becoming a Catholic in the 30s. It wasn't so easy as now at all. And yes, here I am. And I'm so grateful for that faith.
Yeah.
I am so grateful. And in today's extremely messy Britain, there are a lot of very good people who are trying to live the good way, but without the firm teaching of the Catholic faith, you know, the awful thing is I think it's so easy to drift. You can start by saying, for example, I know that homosexual activity is wrong, but whereas if you're a Catholic, you know why it's wrong. You have the whole rich tradition of the Church, Christ and his bride, man and woman, bride, you know, you have a rich theology, the theology of the body. You can really, I'm so grateful to be a Catholic, you know.
In America, it is true that one of the key issues or themes that divides Catholics from non-Catholics is the Holy Father. All right? But there's another issue that also divides them, and that's Our Lady.
Ah, yes.
And I wonder, in England, where is the thread of Our Lady throughout both Anglicanism as well as your own Catholicism?
Well, I would say she's always been important. And remember that because the Anglican Church inherited, let us say, all the beautiful old Catholic churches, and I mean, one of the great glories of England and the English countryside, absolutely unbearably beautiful churches. I mean, almost unbearably beautiful. And when I was a little girl, and you'd go to one of these ancient churches on a country walk, particularly on holiday, if it was raining and you couldn't be on the beach, you would go for a walk. And you'd stomp around and there'd be these glorious churches. And my sister, in her teens, got interested in brass rubbing. You put a bit of paper down on one of these beautiful old tombs and then rub it with a dark wax pencil and get the image. But all around you would be images of Our Lady. She'd never gone, you see, in the stained glass and so on. The Reformers tried to bash out a lot of the images, but inevitably a lot were left. And in the 19th century, the great revival in the Anglican Church, John Henry Newman, who eventually became a Catholic, of course, but he revived devotion to the saints and Our Lady by the way he wrote, the way he saw the fathers and so on. So you got an image of Our Lady restored to the Anglican Church. And now, in most Anglican churches, there will be images of Mary. Not only in high Anglican churches, but just in general. She never left England. And there was this tradition in England. There are more churches named after Our Lady in England than I think anywhere else on earth. They're called St. Mary's this and St. Mary's that. With a Catholic revival, you have this idea of Our Lady of Ransom, Our Lady of Reparation, Our Lady who will get her dowry back. And I was always taught, pray to Our Lady and England will be reconverted. And England, too, the best of our heritage, has a sort of gentleness and tolerance and humour. And that's very Marian, you know,
well,
very Marian.
One Marian shrine that I think of is Our Lady of Walsingham. And it has quite a history, as, you know, I think... was it Chaucer, you know, that talks about the pilgrimages way back when? I think that was a part of it, but
yes.
It's gone through went through a time of demolition and all of that.
Yes.
And now is there not only come back, but the Ordinariate itself is connected there. Yeah.
Yes, the great revival of Walsingham. At the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th. It began at the end of the 19th. This lady, Charlotte, who revived the Walsingham Shrine and in the process became a Catholic. So she then created this little, or helped to foster into being, let's say, this revived Catholic shrine. And then in the 1920s, an Anglican clergyman, the Reverend Hope Patton, who revived the Anglican shrine. And now the Holy Father makes this magnificent historic gesture to Anglicans. Come on in, cross the Tiber, just pack everything you can on the boat. Some of your best traditions, Evensong, bring it, you know, Harvest Festival, bring it, some of the hymns, we already sing them, but bring them. Apart from anything else, we would say in England, please bring them, because we're so sick of the rubbish. We don't need Kumbaya. Bring us the hymns, bring us a certain dignity, bring us that sense of reaching out to the whole nation, bring us the Bible, you know, in the way you appreciate it. Now, come on, just come. And a lot have. I want a lot more to come, please, because I honestly think the Anglican Church, in the most tragic way, it's all over, really. Once you have women bishops, which is the next thing that's coming, any concept of apostolic succession has gone. I mean, it wasn't there anyway, but you could say there was a sort of way of trying to claim it. Well, as soon as you ordain women, it's not possible. The Church cannot, not may not, but cannot ordain women. Not because women are inferior, absolutely not, but because the plan of God lived out in Jesus Christ is what they choose men. And this is very profound. It's like bread and wine at the Eucharist. You can't do apples. It has to be bread and wine. The stuff of the priesthood is very men. There's a lot we could say about that, but it's non-negotiable. So Anglicans are coming in. And the Holy Father, who knows England pretty well, he really has a good understanding of England. He loved John Henry Newman, and he just is a man who absolutely understands England very well as an academic and so on, called the new Ordinariate, the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham. And the special patron is John Henry Newman. I have, like a lot of Catholics in England, great hopes of the Ordinariate. We long for the Anglicans to bring with them a tradition of dignity and liturgy, an English humour. They are good fun. The Anglican Ordinariate chaps I've met are very amusing. The only thing is, it's going to be difficult. There is hurt feelings on the Anglican side. No, they can't make use of the glorious old churches, which we wanted. We hoped maybe they could be shared. But in 20 years' time, who knows what will happen. I could see a bright future there. But the thing to invoke is Our Lady of Walsingham. And Walsingham is in a particularly glorious part of England. Very lovely countryside, bit bleak, but glorious in its bleakness. It's about 6 miles from the sea, and the wind comes straight from the North Sea. And there's a great beauty in Our Lady of Walsingham, and I was there just recently, and I mean, it's almost heartbreakingly lovely. A really glorious countryside. And Walsingham's a nice little village with tea shops and nice pubs and all that. And in the winter, it's deliciously bleak, really almost nobody there. And in the summer, very, very warm and beautiful, because it's just an enchanting bit of England that's bleak in the winter, but in the summer, lovely, green, green, green fields and little sheep. Oh, it's lovely. And Our Lady, you feel very close to her there, because people have walked barefoot that holy mile from the Slipper Chapel to the village so many times and praying the rosary. Oh, Our Lady of Walsingham, pray for us. She'll cope with the difficulties, and there are difficulties. There are big difficulties facing the Ordinariate, financial, all sorts of difficulties.
Of course. Like, we have an email which I think kind of connects to that. This comes from Chris from Florida. I am currently an Episcopalian and am interested in Catholic conversion. I have been watching EWTN for many years and have gradually eliminated most fears and prejudices about the Church. I recently visited St. Peter's in Rome, and words cannot express the renewal of faith I experienced after my visit to the Vatican. I understand the Catholic Church has created a special path to conversion for Anglicans and Episcopalians. How can I learn more details while I prayerfully move forward with my conversion decision? Your help is appreciated. So he's interested. He's being drawn. He's hearing about the options. As you said, some are open to these options, so they need to know practically, how do I make this move? We in the Coming Home Network, that's what we do to help people make the move, and one thing we recognize is it isn't always easy. And the Ordinariate especially is for a minister and his flock. Yes.
Not every Anglican who comes into full communion with the Catholic Church will do so through the Ordinariate at all. And the Church,
provision
it's a provision to groups of Anglicans, Anglicanorum Cetibus. It was to groups of Anglicans, and the idea is you come in with your flock. And there are individual decisions to be made, because every member of that flock has to make their own decision. And that's one way into full communion. But it does have to be said that you can simply become a Catholic, and the Holy Church makes the possibility for you to be ordained as a Catholic priest, although she doesn't promise it, because it's not you don't have a right. None of us have a right to the priesthood in any sense at all. But these are different ways home. And then there is a very different tradition coming from the evangelical and free churches, which is another journey which brings its own richness, I have to say, to the Catholic faith. It really brings its own richness. I would say the Anglican Ordinariate is in its very early stages, and there will be, I think, some difficulties along the way. And I'm not saying that from my knowledge. I'm saying it from what these good men have told me. And there are some heartaches, because you can bring your flock, but not all. And you can't necessarily bring your church. And there are tragic difficulties with old friends who don't understand, and also maybe family members who don't understand. And I'm learning this, that for me, as a born and brought up a Catholic, I don't think we should underestimate some of the heartaches involved. So I hope your correspondent, this chap, I would say, if you knew how we are praying for you, if you knew how we want you in our church, the gifts you'll bring, and even the experience of difficulty that you'll bring will be united with all that richness in the church. Maybe God has got some great plan here. Oh, please come, and also please teach us something, also even through your own suffering, I hope that doesn't sound pompous, but when he talked about being in St. Peter's, I can echo that. I remember once standing there and thinking, gosh, beneath us are the bones of the first apostle Peter. That's so exciting.
Well, I was going to also say that in America, And after all these years, I can't remember if I've said it 50 times on the Journey Home program. I apologize if I have. But one of the biggest differences that I sense between America and England or Europe is that in America, on any corner, there may be 4, 5, 6 churches, all in town. You may have towns full of churches, but none are older than the others. You may have some built in 20 years, or 50, but an old church in America is 200 years.
Yeah.
So you don't have this sense of history that draws you to think, boy, this church has a whole lot more of a depth of its historical foundation than this church over here, which was started on Tuesday. You get to Europe, you get to England. I remember when I visited there, and I'm standing before the Canterbury Cathedral. It's like, whoa, this outdates America.
Of course, I do think that's one thing that makes conversion in that sense easier in England. It's very difficult for me to see it from the perspective of somebody in Italy or France or something. And I think that glorious unbroken tradition, I remember as a little girl being told, well, in Italy they never lost the faith. You have this, oh, how wonderful and how dreadful of us in England, Henry VIII, how dreadful of us all, But it has its own difficulties because there's a taking it for granted thing, that the church will always be there. And the present Holy Father has been saying it won't always be there unless you go to Mass. It won't be there. This church could be a mosque in a few years if you're not careful, or just closed. Please, the faith is every single person making a decision every day. But certainly in England, yes, you see these grand old churches, and who built them with what faith, what happened in them, and it's clear this was Catholic. Well, either they were hideously wrong, truly hideously wrong for over 1,000 years in their sense of the Mass, the sacraments, confession, that there is a real forgiveness through ministry of a priest, or they were right. I think the other thing you have to understand, I remember being taught, I have to say, in a Catholic school, was that yes, there were corruptions in the medieval church. The church has always got its corruptions, and golly, we've seen that in recent times too, hideous abuse and so on. The church had its corruptions, and they were partly in those days connected with power. The church always needs to be reformed. And a lot of what Luther said was right. It's just that he broke with Rome, and that's what was wrong. But, a lot of what he said was absolutely what Thomas More was saying about the corruption of the clergy and so on. And I think we need to understand that there's an unbroken truth, but there's also the church, which always needs reforming. And when you see an old church, you think that was Catholic. It should be Catholic now.
I remember when my first trip to England, I'm looking at these, I was with a priest, and I looked at this church, and I said, I can tell this is stolen property, because all the places where the saints were are empty.
Yes, they'd been knocked out.
Everything's been changed here. We do have an email that Linda from New York, Buffalo, says, if there was one saint that Joanna would recommend to help someone today who is genuinely struggling with living a holy life,
gosh,
who would she recommend?
Well, if it was an easier question, if there's one saint of somebody who would like to convert, I would go for Blessed John Henry Newman, who agonized his way in that sense into the church. Living a holy life. Well, this probably sounds awfully easy, but I would go for Blessed John Paul, because he was not a martyr, although he very nearly was. He was not somebody who struggled his way into the Catholic faith. On the contrary, like so many of us, he was born and brought up a Catholic. But he achieved what he achieved because he was holy. It's the hours that he spent in prayer. We now know, because people close to him have said, that they would find him prostrate before the Blessed Sacrament. He often spent a night in prayer that way. Holiness. Do you know, I would go for John Paul. Also, he was a modern man. He was holy in that most difficult of centuries, the 20th century. And not all the popes have been holy. They've all been the rock on which, but they haven't all been holy. So in terms of holiness, and also his way of praying, he prayed the rosary. Well, he was a man of great intellect and everything. Also, he was a priest who prayed the office, but he didn't disdain the rosary. Isn't that beautiful? Well, it's a humble prayer, isn't it? It's a very ordinary you and me prayer. I pray it, at the bus stop. And I would go for John Paul.
Some other saints, especially if I'm thinking of England, that I think must be of great prayerful encouragement, are the priests, the recusant priests, who had to live such challenging, simplistic, guarded, sacrificial lives to nurture the faith of the Catholics that were surviving.
What I pray, if the question were different, if it was, can you name a priest, or a saint who would help you in difficult times. For courage, I'd go for the English Martyrs. Yeah. That's a different thing from holiness, but the actual raw courage. I can't be the only person who, at the dentist, I know that sounds silly, but I pray to the English Martyrs. I am in pain, and Edmund Campion, pray for me, help me. And I've sometimes thought, I was once with some friends and we followed the trail of some of the northern priests in Lancashire, living out in the most difficult circumstances, hiding, never knowing where your next safe bed would be or whether the knock on the door would come. And I've been doing some study at Maryvale, which is the Catholic Institute of Distance Learning in Britain. We had a wonderful week of Catholic history, and we went to a fine old house which had 3 priest holes, and superb lecturer with us, and he asked for a volunteer to go into the priest hole, and I remember thinking, no thank you. And one of our group, who was skinnier than me, hopped into, and there was a trap door that shut. And I remember, I think we all thought, oh, how beastly for her being in there. And when she came out, we all laughed and it was fun, but she said, no, it wasn't nice at all. You could be hiding in a priest hole for 3 or 4 days. They might have had time to put a bucket in there for your needs. They might not. You might get some food or water. You might. Sometimes when you were found, you were already hungry, thirsty, dirty. Then you were taken to the tower. I mean, it doesn't bear thinking about. If you want courage, pray to the English Martyrs. And I've prayed sometimes when I've been frightened or lonely. I've prayed to the English Martyrs. I mean, for courage or in difficult circumstances. I remember once in a thunderstorm when I was out, and I was very frightened. Had some reason to be physically frightened, and I prayed to the martyrs,
And they were in this position not because they would lose their money or their home, but it was for their faith. They were willing to sacrifice this.
For the faith.
For the faith.
And they were not seeking to reimpose a grand Catholicism on everyone. They just knew they must win souls back one by one by one by one. And they didn't know, which we do, that it would all take a heartbreakingly long time. So they lived by faith. I know I must witness to what is true. And all the evidence is that people loved this. They were grateful for the faith and the sacraments. And Campion, the great Edmund Campion, would hear confessions until late into the night and then celebrate Mass in the dawn. And he was very firm with people, exhorting them to be humble and faithful. No, this is an amazing thing. And I owe my faith to these men who cherished and passed on this pearl of great price. And if they had known, that they would never get back those glorious churches, I think they still would have carried on. And it's a real lesson to us. And I don't know whether difficult times are going to come in Britain, but, for all of the West, things are difficult. And any trend that we can see in very general terms in Britain is not good. We now have abortion on demand, and it's regarded as part of being British, and you're right. And tragically, we don't even have the great pro-life movement we have in America. Or we have a pro-life movement, and it's good, and it's very good, but we don't have the numbers that we have in the March for Life. We have homosexual marriage perhaps on the agenda. We have the most disgraceful rubbish taught in sex education in schools, and every supermarket sells the most revolting, lurid, horrible pornography, and our common culture is vulgar to a degree, and there's an awful cruelty too in the way people treat one another, broken marriages, contempt for the innocence of childhood, and also rising crime, rioting. It's not going to be easy, but my gosh, for Catholics we have a heritage, and we can say, right, we cling on to our faith, we teach it, we live it, and we evangelize. And the spirit of the martyrs is alive yet. But we do know about them. I mean, there are schools and churches named in their honour, and increasingly they're honoured. And Pope Paul VI canonised them under the influence of Cardinal Heenan, who was then the Archbishop of Westminster, who could sense that Catholics needed a strong identity. And a lot more children probably know their names than they did a generation ago, because there are a number of our Catholic schools are named after the martyrs, particularly modern schools. And so you will hear non-Catholics referring to the names of the martyrs simply because they mention the name of a school in a netball match or something. So I think the martyrs are coming into their own, which is rather marvellous. But gosh, yeah, we do need to think about them.
Joanna, real quick, we don't have a whole lot of time, but you've done some new episodes to your series, right?
Yes, I have. I've been making celebrations of the saints, and I've been following through the whole calendar with things to make for the feasts and seasons, and I've just done saints, and I've done a whole lot of different recipes for different saints' days. Loved it. Great fun.
What the saints ate, or
No, we don't know. And in fact, some of the saints didn't eat very much, did they? I mean, you think of Catherine of Siena. I baked a Siena cake to celebrate her, but actually she ate very little. There's no evidence she tucked into fruit cakes at all. So,
Joanna, it's a great pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much. And thank you for also the work you do with EWTN on the series, and also your brave work that you do back in the home country and fighting the battles in the name of the church and the values of the church as sometimes a lone voice. So thank you for doing that very much. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. God bless you. See you again next week.